Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, boys and girls. Today's video is a follow-up to some of our more recent AX8 content because I'm going to be showing you how to make a AX8 bass guitar patch for metal. We got the guitar patch basics out there. I thought it was a good time to show you how at least I go about making a bass patch. I will be using my 5-string Wolf bass, which if you're in the market for a decent value 5-string, I would highly recommend you check out the review on this thing. But yeah, let's jump right into it because the way I go about this is fairly different than the way I would normally do a guitar patch. And a lot of that is because every bass is different, a lot more so than guitars. Just as a little bit of a pre-warning, this is an active pickup system with a preamp. And this is going to, play a big role in the sound that you're going to get. So with that out of the way, let me show you how I achieve my metal bass tones using the AX8. So in today's video, I'm going to be cheating a little bit compared to my process for the metal guitar patch tutorial. That's because I'm intimately familiar with guitar signal chains and not nearly as much with bass signal chains. I mean, I know where things should fall, but as far as being able to replicate this tone that I built here live in a video, a little bit more iffy. So I didn't want to skew the results as much as I did in the guitar patch video. So we'll just be walking through these blocks one by one. But to begin, I'm going to turn all of these off because unlike the guitar, it's actually really, really important how you set your bass. So this is what my bass sounds like without any processing. So I can set the sound on this bass guitar a million different ways before I even get into the AX8, and that's something that you don't do on a guitar normally. For most metal basic rhythm sounds, you're going to use the bridge pickup, whether it's passive or active. You're going to have the tone and volume wide open. You're good to go. On a bass, it is so different from bass to bass on how you could set it up, and even on one bass alone, you can get so many different sounds. So on this Wolf bass that I'm using, I could choose between 2 pickups and whether I want to use a preamp that's built in or not. And just turning off the preamp, this is what you're going to get. So as you can see, you get a lot more crisp high end, a lot more definition in the low end with the preamp, but there's a little bit of noise added. And of course, with a really good preamp, you won't get much noticeable noise, but given this is a $600 instrument, not going to expect amazing results with it. And that's with the pickup selector neutral. So I'm not favoring one pickup over the other. So my recommendation starting out would be to just get a good bass sound with whatever you have direct. Whether it be a passive Fender bass, whether it be something active like an Ibanez, whatever you got, just get a good bass sound and feel free to tweak it as you go, because as I'll show you momentarily, it's going to change a lot depending on your signal chain. So with like these drive blocks, I actually play with the frequency cutoff to be able to hold down the low end in one part of the signal chain and cut it off in another. So it's really going to vary instrument to instrument and depending on your taste more than even a regular guitar. So we're going to go backwards here a little bit because I think that's going to make things easier and a little bit more digestible for you guys. So let's start with a cab block, and just turning on a cabinet block, you'll actually get really good bass results. Forgive whatever clipping you may be hearing because I don't have the level set correctly for direct in. But so what we're going to be using here on the cabinet block is some type of built-in bass cabinet. And there's quite a few in the AX8 built-in, not nearly as many as you'd see on the guitar side, obviously. But we've got a few Fender Bassman cabinets, mostly in the 4x10. And we have a single 8x10 in the Ampeg SVT cabinet. And I really like these 1x15s. I wish there were some 4x15s. I love the sound of 4x15 cabinets for bass guitars, but this gets you close. I don't really love the sub kicks. I think it's too muddy. It's okay to mix in with maybe a 4x10 or an 8x10, but just for today's video, I'm going to stick with a classic SVT 8x10 bass cabinet. That's one of my favorite. I'm going to leave the low cut, high cut maxed out. No proximity effect, because I like a little bit more direct sound in my bass guitar. So for me, having something that emulates a microphone isn't really what I need. So sticking with the top row here, I'll explain what this is momentarily, but we're going to go and turn on the amplifier block, as you might imagine we would, although this, you'll find out, is not necessarily what you have to do, depending on the way you want to set it up. For bass amplifiers, you're really going to be choosing between 3 models, and I think there's a couple different variations on those 3 main models. So you have the Bassman series, so you got a 5965 bass guy, which is a Fender Bassman. You have a, see if I can find it, the SV bass, which is an Ampeg SVT, and you have the USA bass. Usually I favor the SVT stuff because I love Ampeg amps in real life, but here recently for just straight metal bass, I've been really liking the USA bass models because these are the Mesa Boogie amps, and I just love everything that Mesa Boogie makes for the most part. So I really like these bass amps because they're just so well defined. They're bright, they're crisp, they're everything I really want in like a preamp of a bass amp in an amplifier. The SVT adds a lot of nice harmonic tube sound, and that can be really cool for, I guess classic rock, and even, heavy metal works fine too, but I really like this for like southern rock and country sounds. I really like this for metal stuff, so feel free to play around with it. But for the way I'm doing it, I'm going to be using a fairly clean bass amp. This is what it will sound with mine. And again, with bypassing the preamp. So really, this is just kind of acting as just a little bit more oomph in the signal chain. I'm not using this as I would a normal amplifier, like with a metal guitar. I'm not using it for high gain. This is being in the Mesa Boogie series of amplifiers. You do have a 7-band EQ on the real thing. The 7-band doesn't really line up with the frequencies on the real model, so I chose to stick with the 8-band that it comes with, and you can, feel free to play with that how you wish. But for what I'm doing here, I wanted a fair amount of treble and kept the bright switch up and just a little bit of input drive. So again, this is kind of just acting as a little bit more of a preamp for me. Going before that, we have a FET boost, and what you'll see here is this is to crunch up the amplifier. So with it, so that is where most of the gain is coming from. Whereas in a guitar type metal patch, I would want most of the gain coming from the amplifier and just boosting the amp. Most of the bass players that I really like, though, use pedals to boost a mostly clean amp. So for here, I chose the FET boost because it sounds really good when you manipulate the frequencies, like the low cut and high cut. And for this, I had the low cut fairly high up, like I would on a FET boost with a null clip type, like I did on the Fortin stuff. And that gives you a lot more high frequency distortion and allows the low end to stay clear. So if we didn't have that, this is the sound you would get. Now, for some people, you may not want that. You may want that disgusting, just bumbly low end, and that's cool if you do. The reason I'm doing this is because I have a split signal chain, and if you watch any of the VST videos that I did, one of them which was for bass, you would see why I'm doing it this way. By the way, that was with the preamp off. That I didn't even realize, so here's with the preamp on. So again, just adding a little bit more high-end definition, some low-end thump. I really like doing the distortion in front of the amp. And, not all metal bass you have to have this highly distorted sound. And I'll show you a trick down here as to how to get a really good sound without using that. Of course, as you can hear, it's noisy as all hell, so I want to put a little bit of a gate in front of it that will also be splitting off into the bottom here. So, that's a pretty straightforward signal chain up here. We got gate, drive, amp, cab. It's about as simple as you can get on any guitar type signal chain. And by itself, it does sound really good. So that sounded pretty good on its own, but let's dive into the second row here of the signal chain. So as you can see, the cabinet and the gate are both being used. I'm going to turn off the gate temporarily so you can just see a little bit of what's going on. And what I have here is basically a clean signal chain with the, a little bit of dirt involved just to accentuate some of the frequencies I like in a bass tone. On the AX8, you can actually use 2 drive blocks, and were this the Axe effects, I would actually use an amp block here probably. No guarantees, but I would maybe do something like a high gain amp on one end and a normal tube bass amp on the other end. But for right now, the way things lay, I really like using this FET preamp because it's mostly clean, and you can do some really nice frequency sculpting and retain a lot of your original bass tone. So again, without it and with it. So as you can hear, that's just a little different from the regular dry signal in. The only processing that's going on, besides giving it just a little bit of dirt, I mean, we're barely talking anything there, is a significant dip in the mids. And what's nice about all these pedals is you can change what that mid frequency is. So I like to take around the 750 hertz area of the bass guitar tone out. I feel like that's where you start getting a lot of your regular guitar frequencies in. And to let it sit well in the mix, I think taking that out starts to sound really good. You could further refine that with a graphic EQ, which I do here to, I leave that, boost that a little bit. So I would, probably take a little bit more out of the mids than I normally would. And that's going to depend very much on the way that you set the EQ on your preamp. So again, don't just take these numbers and say, oh, that's going to work for everything. This works okay for what I'm using. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work good for what you're using. So applied, that'll sound like this. And if I change, the EQ, like here on my preamp, that sounds pretty dull and lifeless. So again, take heed to my recommendations to play with this as you go, because you might make one little change on the bass or treble on the preamp of your bass guitar and it's going to throw off everything. So that is really what the bottom of the signal chain is. So as you've probably already figured out, once you activate all this good stuff up here, this is what you're going to get. Which is both signal chains simultaneously. And if I change these, good, we have them to mute. So if I disable that, that's just the bottom signal. And if I disable that, that's just the top signal, both together. So my overall thought process behind this and methodology is nothing new. So many bass players do this, whether it be recording, live, whatever, is you have one really, really dirty signal that sounds pretty good on its own. You have one clean signal that sounds really good on its own, but maybe not, it's not going to sit so well in a metal mix. Then you mix the two together and then you go, oh, hell, listen to that. You got this really clear low end and definition, but you also have this just nasty distortion that sounds really cool. So that's the way I like to do bass guitars. There's some stuff for like more classic or just regular hard rock stuff that I just like to, overdrive a regular tube amp. But for recording especially, this is the way I do it. And I'm not going to show you here, but what I would normally do for recording is if I like a single impulse response, I would double it, do one of these as a left only, one of these as a right only. And that way, after the fact, once you record these signal chains in stereo, you can then go back and mix the levels accordingly. Because right now, I can tell you that the clean in is a little bit too loud for a mix for my ears. So if I turn this down significantly, that's probably around where I would do it in an album. So if you wanted to do this on your own, like I said, all you got to do is set one of these here to left, one of these here to full pan right, and then have 100% left and right on two different impulse responses. And you can mix and match if you like, say, a 15-inch speaker with the dirty stuff and a 10-inch with the clean stuff. You're more than welcome to do that. But this is basically how I go about metal bass in general. I have one dirty and one clean, and there's nothing that's stopping you from putting a clean amp down here and double drive blocks up here. I know for a fact many bass players such as Dick Lovegren from Meshuggah, you had Nolly, who was once in Periphery. I know for a fact that in their Axe-Fx patches they do one high gain guitar amp for their dirty signal chain, and then one tube bass amp for their clean stuff, or more clean stuff. Hard to call those tones clean at all. So like, say Nolly would use a 5150 really distorted amp, and then they use like something like the SVT. I think that Dick Lovegren used a USA lead on one of them, and then one of the bass amps, or maybe even a clean guitar amp, whatever it was. So if you have a full-blown Axe-Fx, you can definitely experiment with that kind of stuff. But for us plebeians here on the AX8, I would experiment with some more of these like preamp pedals, boosts, and feel free to change the clip type. I like the FET and the op amp stuff for bass guitar specifically. And just to show you once again how much this is going to change, using a balance that I think is pretty good. If I just revert my preamp back to neutral, preamp's still on, but if I go back to neutral here, take me 10 minutes to find where it's at. All right. I did not change the gain or anything, but I did turn the bass and treble a fair bit down, so I'm not getting as much signal out. And if I put it back to about where I had it, without a preamp or without, having those frequencies cranked, it's not high gain enough for me. So don't take these values that I have here as gospel. I would just take the methodology as a really good starting point to get a good bass sound. So I hate that I can't give you much more guidance than that, because with guitar stuff, it's a bit more straightforward. But with this, you're going to have to play with it a little bit depending on what bass guitar you have. And if you have specific questions, I can try to answer them to the best of my ability if you let me know exactly what your setup and stuff is. But this should get you in the ballpark and get you started. For, more modern, djenty stuff, I would, take a dive on the mids a little bit, and maybe having a little bit more distortion, a little bit more clarity in the high end, just to, play nicer with the 8-string guitars if you're going that route. But other than that, this should get you started. So yeah, hope that was interesting and helpful for most of you, and stay tuned for more AX8 tutorials like this one as always. Thanks for watching. Bye.